Episode 55, A Tale of Two Bibles. Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy, an Agora Podcast Network member. Go over to agorapodcastnetwork.com to find more great thought-provoking and independent podcasts. You can learn more about the history of the papacy at a2zhistorypage.com. That's A-T-O-Z historypage.com, which can also be found in the show notes. You can connect and like all the social media from there and link to iTunes, where you can leave a rating and review. Today we're going to talk about the story of two Bibles, or more precisely, two translations of the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament. This is a set of documents written long ago, used by a small tribe living in the Levant, which would become the foundational documents for billions upon billions of followers of three of the world's religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. What is this two Bibles? Well, we're talking about two distinct translation traditions of the original Hebrew. One is called the Septuagint, and the other the Masoretic text. We've talked a little bit about each of these translations and traditions in the past. Today, though, Garry Stevens of the History in the Bible podcast and I really dig in to see where these two traditions developed from, how they are similar, and what are their differences. We will also discuss what the differences between these two textual traditions mean today, practically speaking. The translation of the Old Testament isn't an academic exercise. It deeply affects religious application and scholarly debate. I think you are really going to enjoy this Sidetrack episode, and I'm glad you are joining Garry and I today. If you enjoy these collaborations with Garry Stevens, I really encourage you to give my new podcast series, Beyond the Big Screen, a try. I have a discussion with guests such as Garry, he's on several episodes, on the history, background, themes, and contexts of movies. What is the real story? How does the movie represent the book and or the historical record? What are the major themes the movie is getting at? We talk about all of that and more on Beyond the Big Screen. Learn more at a2zhistorypage.com or again in the show notes. A huge shout out goes to our Constantinople level patrons on patreon.com/papacy. Regan, Sandy, Andy, Paul, Dr. Jeff, Robert, and Sean, as well as our Alexandria level patrons Chris and Francine. I really sincerely appreciate you taking the time to listen, and I look forward to seeing you on our next stop on our trip through the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Well, thank you very much for joining Garry and I today. We're talking about a topic that's of some interest because I think it's a topic that a lot of people would be interested in, but you almost have to, by definition, take a deep dive into it. And it is comparing the Septuagint to the Masoretic text. And Garry, I know that you've talked quite a bit about this in your show, and you haven't talked. Have you talked about it as such as a standalone episode, or has it been sprinkled throughout the show?
It's been sprinkled like little bits of gold nuggets throughout the normal joss of my episodes.
And we're going to take those nuggets and go and shake them up into one solid nugget today. And why not start with a piece of solid gold with a little satirical play, let's say, that will tie it all together and maybe give us a jumping off point. And Garry, maybe you can start us off with what's a good way to look at this?
Well, we're going to be talking about textual criticism in this episode, and you don't get much more of a deep dive than that one.
Not at all.
No. Now, I want to set up how scholars actually do textual criticism. So let's say, Steve, in 100 years, your podcasts have become religious tracts. Now, in this future, there are scholars who are dedicated to establishing the true Stevensian podcasts, because it's very important that your followers have the truth. Now, in this future time, we only have a few of your podcasts in full. Most are just little fragments. So what is the truth? With so little surviving audio, how can we know what the true Steve actually intended? Fortunately, we do have, again, fragments of notes and scripts that the true Steve made for his podcasts, or at least so we think. Now, evidence from these documents and radiocarbon dating firmly places these documents in the time frame of 1850 to 1980. Now, that's well within the accepted time frames we have for the Stevensian podcasts. Now, some scholars argue for a dating as late as 2000, but they have little support. But these documents, these written documents we have, often differ radically from the audio versions. Are these notes and scripts the reality? And is the audio just a distorted tradition of true Steve's intentions? Well, for that matter, how can we know that the true Steve actually made any recordings at all? An unlikely tradition holds that the true Steve spoke an obscure dialect of English, known as the Great Lakes accent. But most scholars follow the testimony of the true Steve's great-great-grandchildren, many of whom to this day live in the United Kingdom, and they universally insist that the true Steve's native dialect was Cockney, and that all the recordings attributed to him are complete forgeries. So there's a huge debate about that. And there's even one alternative interpretation of the Stevensian canon. Recently, we've got new evidence that makes the interpretation of the Stevensian texts even more complicated. Some scholars have suggested parts that they have dubbed the Stevensian A tradition may have been a collaboration with the author of what is called the Stevensian B tradition. Or it's even possible that Stevensian A is a forgery of Stevensian B. Now, how do we think that there are two separate traditions here? This is because in some of these notes and podcast audio, we have a few references to someone called Garry Stevens in the fragments of audio in the notes. Now, the majority position is that this name is simply a scribal mistranscription of the true Steve, since both names mean exactly the same, which is crown of warriors. They insist that there is a unified Stevensian audiophonic tradition made by a single author who lived sometime between 1850 and 1950. Nonetheless, it is quite possible that during this fascinating period of history, there could have been multiple Stevensian traditions existing at the same time. But and it must be said, that fundamentalist Stevensians do not accept these radical interpretations.
And obviously, this little vignette we've created almost exactly mirrors the situation that gives us the Septuagint and the Masoretic textual traditions of the Hebrew Bible, or what is also called the Old Testament. Garry, in very, very broad strokes, what is the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible?
The Old Testament, or the Tanakh, is a collection of books produced over centuries, written almost entirely in Hebrew, although there are some Aramaic bits in them. They were written by many different authors over quite a long period of time, and they have very complex textual traditions. Both Jews and Christians are concerned that we have, what would you call it, an authoritative text. Even though the whole notion of authoritative text is a little bit dodgy. For a lot of these books, was there ever an original? Maybe not. Maybe some of the books always existed in different versions, and only over a long course of time were these different versions sort of gathered together, edited, and set down as some sort of authoritative standard. Now, in the Jewish tradition, the authoritative version of the Old Testament, the Tanakh, is called the Masoretic tradition. This tradition holds that there is one single true authoritative text for every single book, every single word in the Old Testament, and that this tradition has been carried out meticulously for centuries. Now, we know pretty much that the Hebrew Bible has been copied really very accurately since about the year 1000, maybe a generation or two before William the Conqueror. And this tradition we call the Masoretic tradition. The Masoretes were Hebrew scribes living in the Islamic world from about the end of the Roman Empire until, well, William the Conqueror's time, who took it upon themselves to preserve the texts and, most importantly, preserve them with absolute accuracy, because it was essential to their theology that every text was copied generation by generation exactly the same. No variation allowed whatsoever. And the Masoretes developed a very interesting system for preserving the accuracy. One of the problems with the Hebrew language is it doesn't have any vowels. Big problem. So the words bit, bet, bat, but are written with the same two consonants, and you have to work out what the vowel is in the middle. The Masoretes came up with an extra system of transcription of little dots and symbols and signs throughout the Hebrew text to indicate to scribes what the correct word was or the correct phrasing. And they'd have little marks, for example. One type of mark was often put next to a word if the word was very odd. Sometimes in the Bible, a Hebrew word is used just once in the entire text. So they would put a little mark saying, yes, this really is this particular word. I know you've never seen it before, but it's meant to be here. So it was saying basically, do not change this.
This is an oddball and it's okay.
Exactly. This is an oddball, but that's just fine. So they came up with a system which partly remedied the lack of vowels, but also was an extra apparatus for preserving the accuracy of the text. The oldest complete Masoretic text we have today is called the Aleppo Codex, and it dates from pretty much the year 1000. That's been established by completely accurate dating methods, although the book itself does say, it was written in, I think, 1009 AD. And this codex, so we have this particular document, which is 1,500 years old. No, wrong. We have this particular document, which is over 1,000 years old, and that is today considered the master text. Until we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was the oldest document for the Hebrew Bible. Now that we have some Dead Sea Scrolls, we have documents which go back another 1,000 years before that, and they're pretty remarkable in how much they agree with the Aleppo Codex. There aren't that many changes, but there are some. But in general, we can say that the Masoretic tradition, which is preserved in this thing called the Aleppo Codex and in another book called the Leningrad Codex, has managed to preserve the original text really very well over the course of 1,000 years.
All right, for this one, we're going to have to throw it into reverse a few hundred years to go to something called the Septuagint, which is also often put into shorthand as the LXX. Tell us a little bit about where that one comes from.
The Septuagint is the name given to a textual tradition and documents which are translations from the Hebrew into Greek. The story goes that under Ptolemy II, who I presume is the second guy called Ptolemy, in the Hellenistic kingdom of Egypt, the story goes that he invited some Jewish scholars to come down to Egypt and translate the Old Testament into Greek. Because at that time, and this is about 270 BC, something like that, at that time, there were quite a large number of Jews living in Egypt, and most of them spoke Greek. They didn't speak Hebrew. Hebrew wasn't a really popular language. It was a liturgical and religious language, but most Jews at that time would have spoken either Greek or Aramaic. So they didn't have access to their own religious texts. So the story goes that 72 scholars, 6 from each tribe, were invited to translate the Old Testament, and these translators set to work. They completed their work in 72 days, independently of each other, and it was found that their translations from the Hebrew and the Greek agreed exactly, word for word. What a great story. Whether it's true or not, who knows? But the Septuagint, this Greek version of the Hebrew, then became the standard religious text which most Jews used for centuries. In particular, in the New Testament, pretty much all the quotations from the Old Testament are from the Greek Septuagint. They don't seem to have come from any Hebrew original. Jesus, if he knew the Old Testament, and I suppose he would, his dad wrote it, then then he would have known it in the Greek version, almost certainly not in the Hebrew.
What really baffles me about this, or what is so confusing about this, is there's so much quicksand you can step into. There really seems to be that between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, both of them set out with two different goals in mind. The Septuagint was to take a document that was written in one language and translate it into another language. That's something that I can actually bring into some professional understanding of. In my day job, we do a lot with translation, and translation is not a science. It's really an art. And you need somebody who understands both languages intimately, and they really need to know the text intimately as well. Whereas the Masoretic text, they're really trying to take a document in one language and make sure that it's preserved so that it has a continuity to continue on into. Does that seem reasonable, that both of them have a different goal in mind?
Yeah, they're completely different goals, really, aren't they?
And in that, something that does kind of come out is that the canon that both of them present are slightly different. Both the Septuagint and the Masoretic text don't include all of the same Old Testament books.
No, they don't. The Septuagint contains quite a number of books which are not preserved in the Masoretic text. For example, the Septuagint, in its Greek, has the books of Tobit, Judith, 4 books of Maccabees, Wisdom, Baruch, and Sirach, and also an interesting document called Esdras Alpha, which is not the book of Ezra. That's in the Septuagint, the book that Protestants and Catholics call the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are called Esdras Beta. So there are different books here. Now, what we don't really know is, why are these books in the Septuagint? Is it the case that everyone thought they were proper books for the Bible at that period, and then later the Jews decided, no, we don't really want them? Or was there some other process? You'll find that the books that are in the Septuagint, which are not in the Masoretic text, are in Catholic Bibles and in Orthodox Bibles. Protestants pretty much kicked those books out, thanks to Martin Luther. Martin Luther thought they were dodgy, and pretty much all Protestants have followed that since. So the Septuagint books, which are not in the Masoretic text, are present in some Bibles. Maybe your aunt has them in her Bible, but you may not be able to find them in your Bible.
Would you say that generically, do the Protestant Bibles line up with the Masoretic text as far as the Old Testament goes?
When it comes to the canon, yes, definitely. The Protestant canon is identical to the Jewish canon. The only differences are that, for example, the books of Samuel and Kings are single books in the Jewish canon, but each is split into 2 in the Protestant. That seems to have been based on a decision made by St. Jerome, who, to make things even more complicated, translated the Bible into Latin, and I think he split the books up, because both those books, for example, are pretty big books. But apart from that, the 2 canons are identical.
Let's see if we can make it even a little bit more complicated. Universally, would you say that Jewish groups use the Masoretic text?
Oh, yes. It's impossible for them to use anything else. The Masoretic text they hold is the text. And look, we have this 1,000-year-old document to prove it. It's stayed exactly the same for centuries. No Jew would even think of using anything else but the Masoretic text.
Now I mean, this whole thing is complicated, but it gets complicated because if we go back to the common point of before there was a Christianity and before there was a modern Judaism, I mean, we could probably go back to, let's say, Second Temple Judaism. What was going on with the text at that point? Because we actually do have some evidence of what was going on back there.
It's pretty clear that in the Second Temple period, before the Romans burnt it to the ground in AD 70, there were a lot of texts floating out there, different books which never made it into either the Septuagint or the Masoretic text. And there were also different textual traditions. And we see that in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most of the Dead Sea Scrolls do, in fact, accord with the Masoretic text, but some of them, only about 5%, seem to follow a textual tradition that is represented by the Septuagint, and another 5% seem to follow a textual tradition which is neither. And when I mean textual tradition, I mean there are differences literally in the text. And it's not just because the Septuagint is in Greek and the Masoretic text is Hebrew, and it's just, differences in translation. It's clear that there are differences in content and meaning.
Was the Septuagint translation that looks like it was more or less contemporary to the Dead Sea Scrolls?
The earliest, yes, it would be contemporary with the earliest of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Apparently, the last Dead Sea Scroll, I think, is dated to maybe 50 AD, something like that, and the earliest Dead Sea Scroll would date from the very earliest Hellenistic times, which would be exactly the time of Ptolemy II, who supposedly commissioned the Septuagint. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, yes, they would be contemporary with the making of the Septuagint translation. Yeah.
Because you got to kind of ask yourself, why the heck did Ptolemy all the way in Egypt want to make a translation of a sacred Hebrew document? And why would the Jewish population of Egypt really care about making a translation into the Greek?
I think because Jews were very influential in Egypt. I think I've read that the population of Alexandria, the premier city of Egypt and indeed the entire Eastern world, was about 1/3 Jewish. They had a very substantial presence. And Jews had been in Egypt for centuries. I mean, if you go back to the time of Abraham is recorded as sojourning in Egypt for a while. They had very strong relations. So I think the reason the Septuagint was commissioned was to cater for that population. And of course, the Ptolemies like to think of themselves as intellectuals. I mean, they did have this really good library after all, and they were quite keen to populate it with enormous texts or huge numbers of texts. I mean, someone once said, you're a history buff if you still get upset about the burning of the Library of Alexandria.
And wasn't it at that point that the Jewish population of Egypt was becoming more Hellenized, and that their knowledge of Hebrew, that they were becoming more Greek-centric at that point?
I think very much so. Hebrew had always been a minority language, and Hebrew was only an important language for the Jews during the time of the Davidic kingdom and its successor kingdoms. And even then, most Jews would have spoken either Akkadian in the early years or Aramaic, because those languages were the lingua franca of the Middle East. Hebrew was only spoken by a really quite small number of people, and even then as a specialized language. So the Jews had a very great tradition of being bilingual to a great extent, first in Akkadian, then in Aramaic, and latterly in Greek. So it would have been natural for them to accept a text in a foreign language. I mean, even today, the Talmuds, the digest, the scholarly digests, which were written centuries later, they're written in Aramaic, not in Hebrew.
What I also think is interesting, and I'm not sure if you can address this exactly, is when we move into the first century CE or AD, whichever you prefer, what would have the average Joe in Palestine, Israel, that person have been more comfortable with the Septuagint or with what this proto Masoretic text? What would they have seen when they were going to synagogue or going to the temple?
That's a very good question. I think if they were rural folk, they might have heard a lot of things in Aramaic, and Hebrew was a bit sort of, even then it wouldn't have been that strong. If you're a city dweller or someone like a merchant or a scholar, you would have probably encountered it in Greek, I think.
And so at that time, based on the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is a strong proto-Masoretic tradition, we might call it.
Yes.
But then the Septuagint was obviously out there because that's what the New Testament or the gospel writers were quoting, was straight Septuagint. And as that time went by, so at this time, even though they say that the Masoretic texts or the Masoretes are really working probably about 500 to 600 years later, there was something of their tradition still going on at that time.
It would seem to be the case. I would have thought that if you were a purist Jew who really didn't like Hellenism and these damn foreigners everywhere, you would have certainly gone for Aramaic and Hebrew. But if you were more cosmopolitan or liberal, you would have been looking at Greek.
The Masoretes, we can call that text that came out of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Qumran like a proto-Masoretic text or a proto-Masoretes, but the Masoretes were really a specific group that operated in what really you could call the Middle Ages. You can't even really connect it even into antiquity, that they did start quite a fair bit after the fall of the Roman Empire and all that. What was their story?
We don't know. We literally don't know. There's very little information about it. In fact, there's very little information about what happened to the Bible between, say, high antiquity, the Roman Empire, and that period of the Masoretes. We have no textual witnesses. I mean, there are no documents between the time of the Aleppo Codex around about 1000 and the Dead Sea Scrolls, which finish around about 70 AD. There just is nothing. Oh, there are quotes in other people, but we don't have, a little bit of the book of Esther from that time. All we know is that a group of people called the Masoretes took it upon themselves to construct an authoritative text. And there were huge Jewish scholarly camps, both in Babylon and in Palestine. We have good historical evidence for that. But the actual story of the Masoretes, it's pretty vague. We have some names. There are family names. The Ben Asher family is known, and I think the Ben Naphtali family, but it's all pretty murky. We just have some historical documents which refer to these people and say they did this and they did that, but that's about it. It's sort of lost in the mists of time.
And it's kind of interesting, the Aleppo Codex, the one we talk about, it was a codex,
yes,
which when I think of a Jewish synagogue, I think of the scrolls. And you're telling us it's a codex, or of what we would think of as a book format.
Yes, that's a very interesting development. They are books, not scrolls. Books may have been an invention of the Christian community, actually, although they were certainly promulgated by Christians mainly, because they are a really significant technological development up from a scroll. A scroll is very difficult to use. You have to unscroll it and re-scroll it. A book, well, you can invent a bookmark for a start, so you can be aware of different portions of the text near simultaneously. A scroll, you can't do that. A codex was a really big innovation, which made reading easier, much easier. So I presume the Jewish scholars said, this is actually a good idea. Let's use books. But of course, the tradition of a scroll is still present in modern Judaism, and the Torah scrolls are considered, well, they're quite different to a printed Hebrew Bible. You will find in, say, modern Hebrew Bibles will often have chapter and verse numbers, which were largely taken over from the Christians. You never, ever find that in a Torah scroll, because that is a sacred document. Whereas a printed book, that's not really so holy compared to the scroll. But yeah, they used codices, which worked out really quite well in the end.
I think that's one thing that in the modern eye, you can't really see at how big of a quantum leap in technology a codex was over a scroll. Like, I think even if our audience is below probably 40 years old, like using a microfiche where you have to roll through it, that is such a pain in the neck over flipping through a book.
It certainly is. Or even if you think, I don't know about you, but here when you graduate from university or whatever and you get your little diploma, it's always rolled up and put in a little cardboard tube. So that's like a tiny little scroll. Now, if you pull out the cardboard tube, you just see nothing. You see the back of the diploma. Now, compare that to having your diploma put in a little frame, flat, and you can see it. So really that's the difference between a scroll and a codex. A scroll, even for something as small as a single-page diploma, you have to unwrap it, and it's self-wrapping, to use the damn thing, as opposed to just looking at it.
Then with the scroll, you need you need something to wind it up on and wind it through. Which if you're talking about a big scroll, you might need 2 people to do that. That might be a 2 or a 3-man job.
Yes, it would have been. And usually for big texts too, they would be in multiple scrolls. A large book might have a dozen, 20 different scrolls to it. So you'd have to work out, well, which scroll has the bit that I want, as opposed to a book where you can flip through it and go, oh yeah, okay, here's the page. So scrolls are physically more difficult to store. They take up a lot more space. A book is just so much more convenient.
This Aleppo Codex, and they know that it was written in sometime in the Middle Ages. What was the provenance up with it up until just about the modern age?
They're not entirely certain, but the Aleppo Codex seems to be a manuscript which was used by the great Jewish scholar Maimonides. I think that's how you pronounce it.
And he's a big name.
He's the biggest name you can get, pretty much. You don't get bigger than him. The Codex seems to have been written in the city of Tiberias, which is on the Sea of Galilee, not that far from Jerusalem. And Tiberias was a major center of Jewish scholarship. The Jewish community in Jerusalem seems to have purchased it maybe 100 years after it was made, so that'd be about 1100 AD or CE. Now, during the Crusades, the synagogue that it was stored in was plundered and it got transferred to Egypt in Old Cairo. That's where Maimonides seems to have read the thing, and he described it as the text trusted by all Jewish scholars. Tick, such a seal of approval. That's an astonishing thing to say of a particular document. And it's rumored that Maimonides, the story goes, Maimonides' descendants then took it to Aleppo in Syria, and it stayed there for hundreds of years. The synagogue where it was stored in Aleppo was burnt down in 1947, and the Codex mysteriously disappeared and then popped up in 1958. Goodness knows where it was then. And it was smuggled into Israel. Now, unfortunately, in the Aleppo Codex, the most important part from the Jewish point of view, the first 5 books, the Torah, are missing. Whoops, big problem. So
yeah, that's a huge
that's a gigantic problem. But there's another codex called the Leningrad Codex, which does contain the complete text. So the first 5 books of the Bible have been reconstructed from this other codex called the Leningrad Codex. The Leningrad Codex is considered a bit inferior because there's some fairly obvious spelling mistakes and that sort of thing. But what can you do? You're missing the most sacred part of the Bible. You've got to get it from somewhere. And the Leningrad Codex, I think, is only about a generation later than the Aleppo Codex. How they exactly date these things, I don't know. But then
it was written in Tiberias or in that general part of the world and then just happened to work its way up into Russia? Is that...
the Leningrad Codex? Yeah, the Leningrad Codex has got an even weirder history. It seems to have been copied in Cairo, again in Egypt. Somehow it made its way to a synagogue in the Crimea, where it was discovered in the 1840s in the synagogue Geniza. And a Geniza is a sort of temporary storage area for scrolls that you don't want, but they haven't been buried yet. In Jewish tradition, a sacred scroll, the only way you can't burn it or throw it out in the rubbish. You have to bury it properly. And a Geniza is a temporary store before you do the formal burial.
Isn't there a Geniza where they found like, is that the Oxycrinus
Oh,
hoard?
um,
Was that a
yes.
Geniza?
No, no. Oh, no, that's separate. You're thinking of the Chirogonesa.
Yes.
Yes, which is separate to the Oxyrhynchus finds. Yes, that is a another temporary rubbish dump, I suppose you'd call it. And they found huge numbers of documents there. These places are really very handy for archaeologists. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
don't
it's
don't ritually dispose of anything
no,
yet.
yeah, don't do that. Look, we have a rubbish room whose sole function is to store outdated, worn out copies of sacred documents. What a gold mine.
It sounds like my desk at work, except nothing's interesting in there.
And nothing sacred there.
No.
So that's the story of the Leningrad Codex. It was picked up by a guy called Abraham Furkovich, actually, who discovered it in the 1840s. And he said, geez, this looks important. And it turned out it was. The Leningrad Codex, the second great codex of the Septuagint, not the Septuagint, of the Masoretic text.
So it's really not out of bounds to say that if they found this Leningrad Codex, that there's not another one floating around out there somewhere.
I'd say there almost certainly is. I mean, there are great Christian codices as well. Codex Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, and they were all found really very recently, I think the 19th century for some of them. So they're out there. There is probably another couple of codices, ancient documents, which are just waiting to be discovered. They're probably in a little local dumpster somewhere near your place. I mean, it's just stumbling across these things.
It's deep under the pile of my paperwork that I should be doing. It's
Yeah.
The next great codices is.
Yeah, don't throw out anything that looks really old and is written in Hebrew, Steve.
Okay, I promise. Now the Septuagint, that translation was made very early, like in the 200s BCE. What's the earliest copy of that we have?
The earliest complete copy of that we have is called Codex Vaticanus, which seems to date from around about the time of Constantine the Great in the Roman Empire, late Roman Empire, around about 300, 400 AD. Now, Vaticanus is a complete edition of the Septuagint and, of course, the New Testament, and it seems to have been in the library, was in the Vatican Library forever, pretty much. It was, in fact, it goes right back to the foundation of the Vatican Library. We know it because there's a catalogue we have from the year 1475, so this is before Columbus, and it mentions this document because the library itself was only founded in 1448, so it's been there forever. Where it came from, we have no idea. Weirdly, the Vatican was really very reluctant to show anyone this codex. It was fairly, scholars knew about it from about 1500 onwards, and they knew it was a really ancient version of the Bible, but the popes were quite reluctant to let anyone actually look at it. It didn't really become accessible to scholars until the 19th century, some 400 years after its first recorded spontaneous appearance in the Vatican Library. So this ancient document no one had access to, which is a pretty big thing to keep hidden.
That is the version of the Old Testament that Constantine put out there.
That's certainly one theory, yes. I think Constantine, it's said that Constantine ordered the creation of, 10, 12 copies of the Bible as, really big luxury editions to give to his relatives at Christmas. And this may have been one of them.
Now, this is really, we're getting back to the very foundations of what Christianity was in the Roman Empire. And you have a Greek tradition and a Latin tradition. And in the Latin tradition, Jerome, he translated the Septuagint from Greek into Latin. Do we know what version of the Septuagint he was working off of? Was he using one of Constantine's?
No, we don't know. Now, Jerome tried to rely on Hebrew documents as much as possible to translate into Latin. He started off making a translation of the Septuagint from Greek into Latin, and then thought, well, I've got Hebrew documents. Why don't I go back to them? So he tended to rely on Hebrew texts, which would have been at least the Proto-Masoretic tradition. But for some books which were in the Septuagint but not in the Masoretic tradition, like Tobit and Judith, he did have to rely on the Septuagint, but I do remember reading we have no idea what particular manuscripts he used or what manuscript traditions. We just don't know. Jerome just seems to have got together everything he could and start translating.
This is really where we start to get into the weeds of the whole thing, because, I mean, it's really not until Irenaeus that he gave us inklings that there was a canon of sorts of the New Testament that was being accepted. But who was it? Jerome who decided what the canon of the Old Testament was? Was it basically what Jerome was able to get his hands on that became the canon? Or was there something, was there a tradition that was deeper than him that uh how how it was decided to go with what would be canonical?
I think for Jerome basically accepted the canon of the Septuagint. So he got the list of books from the Septuagint, but he didn't often rely on the actual text from the Septuagint. So he said, okay, here's the Septuagint. This is our list of books. But some of them he couldn't find in Hebrew, like Tobit and Judith. He was reluctant to include them in his Latin translation, but they were popular. They were in the Septuagint. So, okay, I'll whack them in and translate them into Latin. But as far as I know, Jerome relied on the Septuagint to provide his big list of things to do.
Let's pause just for a second on the canon, because I think we're going to get into that a lot more. But let's talk about translations, because like I was saying earlier, translation can be such a tricky thing. Like, you'll translate something. I was thinking of an example in English when I try and teach my students about the word fine. Fine can mean about 6 different things that are completely different. And those are things that are really hard to translate. What were some of the things that you noticed and that have come up that were difficulties in translating? Like, one thing that I think that comes up a lot in the polemics and the apologetics is the ama, where it could mean virgin, it could mean young maiden. It was translated into virgin into Greek, but that may not have been what it meant exactly in Hebrew. Are there other examples of that?
Yes, sometimes the Hebrew is just plain unintelligible, and even Jewish scholars admit that. One example is, okay, let's go to the book of Deuteronomy. This is a fairly detailed example. Now, Deuteronomy 33:1, and the text goes, "This is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, bade the Israelites farewell before he died. He said, Yahweh came from Sinai. He shone upon them from Seir. He appeared from Mount Poron and approached from Rivervote Kadesh, lightning flashing at them from his right." But, there's a problem. Rivervote Kadesh seems to be a place like Seir or Mount Poron, but there is no place called Rivervote Kadesh. No idea. But if you just change one single vowel of the Hebrew, the line "and approached from Rivervote Kadesh" turns into "with him were myriads of holy ones." Utterly different reading. Utterly different reading. So just a single vowel. And remember, Hebrew does not have any vowels, so they have to be interpreted, and that's what the Masoretic text did. But the Masoretes could have gone, does this say bit, bet, or bat? I don't like it if it says bit, so I think it says but. And they made those sorts of...
And like you said, it could also be about.
It could also be about. And there are certainly some passages in the Masoretic text. For example, there are some things which are missing. There's somewhere, I think, in Samuel where it's talking about King Saul. And if you look at the King James Version, it says, "And King Saul reigned 20 years." That's just made up. In the Masoretic text, there is no number. It just says, "And King Saul reigned years." There's something missing.
No.
Literally missing. And the editors of the King James Version said, no, this can't be right. Okay, 20 sound like a good number? Good. So he reigned 20 years.
So we really get into problems of translating this Hebrew text, the ancient Hebrew text that doesn't have vowels, doesn't have a lot of context to it. It's been translated into Greek, but there's also a different strain that's tried to keep the text as original as possible. But then it's also been translated into Latin and then English, and that's what we're basically, now we're playing telephone.
Yes, exactly. Now we're playing telephone. I mean, Christians relied on either the Septuagint or the Vulgate right through the 19th century. All translations were either from Jerome's Latin Vulgate or from the Septuagint. And it's only since about, well, actually 1950 that, say, Catholics have said, no, we're going to ditch the Vulgate and we're going to ditch the Septuagint. We'll go back to the Masoretic tradition. So that's really very recent. The King James Bible, again, is based on a tradition which only stems from the great Reformation scholar Erasmus, who came up with something which came to be known as the Textus Receptus, or the received text. And Erasmus simply seems to have got every Greek scroll he could possibly find in order to come up with his version of the Bible. And it was based pretty much on the Septuagint. The manuscripts he actually used, we don't know, but we do know that he was very eclectic. He'd sort of take one manuscript and say, yep, that's good. But this passage, no, I think that's corrupt, so I'll look at this manuscript. And the King James Bible is basically based on the version that Erasmus constructed, which derives largely from the Septuagint. So you have all these different textual traditions. Some people are using ancient Latin, ancient Greek, ancient Hebrew.
So basically, if your grandma's Catholic, she might have, for example, the Dewey Reams English translation on her shelf, which is a tradition of the Vulgate, which is based on the Septuagint. But if you went to the bookstore today and bought a brand new version of a Catholic Bible, it's probably going to be something based off of the Masoretic text.
Absolutely. The Catholic Bible that I've been using is the New American Bible Revised Edition, authorized for use in North America. Why North America gets its own Bible, I don't know, but that's what the Catholic Church decided. And that version of the Bible, which I think was only translated in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, that uses the Masoretic text and sometimes corrects it with the Vulgate or the Septuagint. So if you bought a modern Catholic Bible today, it'd probably have some fairly different readings in it compared to your grandma's Catholic Bible.
And for those playing at home, that's something that's probably stemming from the Vatican I and Vatican II reforms.
Oh, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that.
Whereas in the Orthodox, either the Eastern or the Oriental, they're staying pretty strictly Septuagint.
Yeah, you're the expert on that.
As far as I know, they're strictly Septuagint. Like we were saying before, we're still playing the game of telephone, where a lot of it is going through the King James version of English translations, where I think English speakers feel like if it has these and thous, it's more legit.
Yeah.
I would be interested to see somebody come out with a translation of the Septuagint straight from Greek into English.
I have such a thing.
Oh, you do? All right.
It's only in PDFs. I don't have a printed version, but it is a modern translation. I think it was done at Oxford, and it is an eclectic translation. That is, we have so many manuscripts of the Septuagint around. There's no such thing as the one true manuscript. So it was assembled from a critical reading of many manuscripts. Yes, I have that. It reads really oddly, actually. Apparently, I was thinking, there are some books in the Septuagint which are notoriously incompetent in Greek translation. Whoever did them from the Hebrew just botched it up totally. And scholars go, oh, Jesus, why did we have to have this idiot, translate this book? Couldn't we have got a high-quality translator?
Does it just come through as garbled, or does it really change the meaning of those passages that can be applied in a theological manner?
I can't really remember which book it is. It's not one of the big theological books where every word matters. And I've only been reading it in the English translation from the Greek. So I'm not quite sure. And I just have to rely on what the scholar is saying when he's saying, this is really difficult this is difficult to read in Greek and almost impossible to translate into any sort of decent English.
Yeah, because I wonder if it was a crappy translation, part of my French, then you're working off of bad Greek to translate it into English, which could be translated into bad English, and then you have a totally different meaning on it. That's a big deal.
Yeah, that is a big deal. I think scholars are just glad that most of the books of the Septuagint seem to have been fairly competently translated from Hebrew. Okay, Steve. Now, there are differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text on the level of individual sentences and paragraphs, but often they aren't that big. On the opposite end, there are differences in the number of books. The Septuagint has more books, but there are also differences between the two textual traditions, sometimes inside books. Now, the book of 1 Samuel is one of the places where the two traditions really diverge very widely. And I'll give you an example. 1 Samuel chapters 16 to 18. Now, the story as it's told in the Septuagint of how David meets Saul. In the Septuagint, the story goes, Saul is feeling sad. Oh, so sad. Now, and he hears of a lyre player called David. He says, okay, I feel like some music now. So how about some music? And David soothes Saul's spirit. Now, Saul knows exactly who David is. He's the lyre player and psychiatrist. And Saul makes David a warrior in his army. In the next section of the story, David challenges and defeats Goliath, and the Philistines are defeated. The people rave about David. Man, are you great? Saul, nah, I'm the king. I'm the only one who's allowed to be called great. Saul gets jealous. Saul demands David pass a test as a ploy to get rid of him. So Saul says to David, okay, you can marry my daughter. What an honor is that? Michal, all you need to do is get me 100 Philistine foreskins. That story doesn't come up too much, does it, in Sunday school? You know, can you imagine teaching that to 80-year-olds? Now, David turns the tables on the hapless king and returns with 200 foreskins. So David ends up with Saul's daughter and Saul's undying enmity. That's the story told in the Septuagint. It's fairly straightforward. The Masoretic text is much longer. There are whole new sections stuck inside these two chapters, 16 to 18. In the Masoretic text, it goes like this. Okay, firstly, like the Septuagint, Saul is afflicted with melancholy. Here's this lyre player called David. Great. David becomes a warrior in Saul's army. Now the Masoretic text sticks in a section in which Saul offers a prize to the man who can kill Goliath. If you kill Goliath, he says, you will get riches and my daughter Merav. What? That's a second daughter. Not Michal, but another one called Merav. Okay? The Masoretic text then continues. David is now reintroduced into the story as though he'd never appeared before. He's reintroduced as a shepherd boy. The Masoretic...
So even though he was in that story earlier,
yes,
as a lyre player...
Yeah, and a member of Saul's army. So that's all forgotten. David now reappears out of the blue as a shepherd who just happens to be on the battlefield when Goliath issues his challenge. In the story, I think David is bringing some fresh bagels to his brothers who are in the army. So David is reintroduced as though the previous story just didn't happen. David challenges and defeats Goliath, like in the Septuagint, and then the Masoretic text inserts another section. Amazingly, Saul has no idea who David is. Who's David?
Never heard of him.
Never heard of him. And he has to ask his General Abner. Again, Saul gets jealous, as in the Septuagint, and Saul demands that David pass a test in order to marry his daughter Michal. Merav, she's lost to history. She disappears from the story completely. And finally, the Masoretic text inserts a quite long love scene, brotherly love scene, shall we say, between David and Saul's son Jonathan. So the Masoretic text inserts passages into the Septuagint version which break up the story and make it unintelligible. That's one of the big differences we find between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. It doesn't happen that often, but when it does, it can be quite spectacular.
Does that have a huge impact on anything? Like, where did they get this? Why did they cut and paste this piece in there? Is there any commentary on that?
There is. Scholars are undecided.
Of course.
Until recently, it used to be thought that the Septuagint is a cut-down version of the Proto-Masoretic text. that whoever translated this book looked at the Hebrew and thought, nah, this doesn't make sense. Let's get rid of the inconsistencies here, shall we? And he constructed the Septuagint that way. That was the belief until recently. Now it is thought, not that the Septuagint is cut down, but that the Septuagint is probably the original or more likely version, and that the later Masoretes, or Hebrew scholars through the centuries, whacked in their own little favourite stories, even if they didn't actually make that much sense in the place that they were assigned to. But debate continues.
What are we going for in that Stevensian version of things? What are we explicitly tying that into?
In our analogy, the Stevensian A tradition might be considered the Masoretic text, and Stevensian B the Septuagint. And scholars are in endless debate as to which tradition is closer to some sort of hypothetical original, if we can even think of the concept of original to start off with. I mean, it's unlikely that, say, someone wrote the book of Genesis, said the end at the bottom of that book. I'll get on to the next one. So here it is, guys, out into the big world. This is the one true master copy. It's almost certain that all the books circulated in various versions in different languages. The process of how they came to be fixed in either the Greek version in the Septuagint or in the Hebrew version in the Masoretic is completely unknown. But scholars have got to be paid, so there are lots of people in universities across the world arguing about what is really going on.
To me, that seems where really the meat of the issue is that both traditions are assuming that there was a perfect document at some point in time that they were basing their translations on, which just doesn't seem to be the case.
No, it doesn't seem to be the case. And partisans for each tradition can get pretty rabid about it. I mean, as I said, the Jews are absolutely insistent that the Masoretic text is the way to go. But some more conservative Orthodox are equally insistent that it is the Septuagint that is correct, and that the later Masoretic text is in fact a corruption of the Septuagint. So partisans can get really very heated about these things.
Yeah, and I can see where the Christian partisans would say that the Masoretic text being written hundreds of years later is trying to kind of flatten out the Christian elements that they're trying to interpret out of the Septuagint. Whereas the Masoretes are saying, well, this is the original score here that we're working off of. And so take it or leave it.
Yes. Some people would argue that the Masoretic text was influenced by Christianity and was fairly keen to eliminate things which could be interpreted in a Christian sense. And in fact, one of the reasons why the Septuagint was eventually rejected by Jews was because that it was adopted by Christians, who then proceeded to either read into it or interpret or extract meanings which the Jews felt were just simply wrong. So in the Jewish mindset, the Septuagint acquired a very bad reputation, or one that they just didn't like at all. So they went back to the Hebrew. And it's the Christians who persisted with the Septuagint. So even at that point, in about the 2nd century AD, you find these partisan views coming to the fore. And that's the way it's been for 2,000 years.
Yeah, and it was really such a complicated brew in the end of the Second Temple into the early 1st century AD that who knows, that it was so complicated on what was Christian, what was Jewish. And then as those two groups started to part ways, then they had to start to lock into things that, that's still being debated today.
Yes. And I think it's impossible to have an impartial or objective discussion about these things because there's too much just emotionally and intellectually vested on all sides. I think you'd have to be like a Hindu, I think, to approach it with indifference.
And even you dig further that when you get into the earliest episodes of your podcast, that it's not agreed upon who even actually wrote these documents in the first place. No. When there's 4 or 5 different traditions in, one document, who knows what was going on back then or what documents that they were working on that were 500 years old at that time. and that are completely gone today.
Exactly. If there ever was an original, and I don't think there was, it's lost through all time. The editing process of how these things were put together, we don't really know. But a lot of people seem keen to make up stories which give some sort of certainty to it. And I think there is no certainty.
Yeah, I think this is one of those situations. People hate this turn of phrase, but the known knowns and known unknowns and unknown unknowns. This is one of the academic senses where that makes the most sense of them all.
I'd agree with that. Yes, there's a lot of.
We don't know anything. Yeah. That's it. That's the end.
Exactly. We pretend to know something.
It's been nice talking to you.
Yeah, exactly. We pretend to know something, but no, we don't really. No, haven't a clue. But still, I've got tenure, so.
Unfortunately, we don't have tenure yet. No. But if you're willing to give out tenures, you can contact us.
Absolutely. Anytime you like.
Well, I thank you very much for joining us today, Garry. It's been great talking to you.
Been good talking to you too, Steve.
And I'm sure we'll be talking again the next time on the History of the Papacy and
History in the Bible podcast.